Okay. It's a pleasure to chair and to organize this macro REAP session, and I have really a pleasure to have here, and I'm grateful that they accept our invitation. Ludwig Straub from Harvard and Gregor Jarosz from Princeton, and they have been doing very, very interesting work, and I'm sure you will enjoy seeing their papers. And so let's just a little bit about how this session will work. You have like 40 minutes for each speaker, with 5 minutes at the end. You could interrupt asking clarifying questions during the presentation. You just unmute your mic and ask the question. And also at the end, probably if there are, it's probably better that you raise your hands, just because the Zoom will make an order of the questions, and then we can proceed at the end of the presentations by the order of the questions. And I think that's it, no? So let's just follow the order that is in the program. We start with Ludwig. Please, Ludwig.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about the commotion in the background. My kids are always entertaining each other, so that's going to be a bit noisy. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's really awesome, especially because this is a very, very recent paper. It's still work in progress. That is actually joint work with a absolutely fantastic Brazilian graduate student of mine, Rodolfo Rigato, who is, I think, here today as well. It's also joined with Adrien Auclair, who is at Stanford. And the title of the paper, at least the working title of the paper right now, is New Pricing Models, Same Old Phillips Curve. So the starting point of this project is this really age-old question of how we should model price rigidities. And I'm going to try to separate sort of two different approaches that have been sort of more or less going on in parallel. So there's the older sort of macro time series approach, where really at the core was the idea that we want to match the time series behavior of inflation. And so this, for example, here on the right, you see kind of an impulse response you get in these types of models. You know, it's sluggish and it's relatively muted. And the way these models are typically written is they're based on Calvo or Rodenberg adjustment. And then we add several real rigidities and price indexation, and then we summarize that in a relationship that I'm going to call for the entirety of the presentation as, you know, a Phillips curve, which is going to be a relationship between the real marginal cost faced by firms and the inflation of their prices. Okay, so that's going to be sort of the macro approach. There's also a sort of a more micro moments approach, which has really flourished in the last 10, 15 years. And here, the goal is really to match pricing moments in the micro data. And so here on the right, you see, for example, price changes as you see them in the micro data. And here, the standard model, the workhorse model that people have been using are menu cost models with their several, extensions, possibly to many products, possibly, including infrequent shocks, et cetera. And sort of the standard object, the standard experiment that's being done at the end of the day in these kinds of models is typically we feed in a permanent nominal cost shock, and we figure out what the price level and output responses are from that. So it's a permanent nominal shock relative to sort of a general real marginal cost shock. And basically what we like to do in this project, and I'm going to show you how far we've gotten so far, is we'd like to start with the micro moments approach, start with a model that we know fits the micro data well, and then we're going to see how far do we get on the macro side. Do we generate a Phillips curve that looks like what we have in the data and the macro sort of time series data, or does it look, different? And if so, what can, bridge that gap? Okay, so we're going to do that in 4 steps. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, I think, do something that a few people have done, namely we're going to actually compute the Phillips curve for menu cost models to first order. And when I say Phillips curve, let me remind you, right, we're thinking really hard about the relationship between real marginal cost and inflation, as you typically use it in DSGE models. And we're going to compute the Phillips curve by basically in a way that allows arbitrary shocks to the real marginal cost. And along the way, we're also going to actually describe what happens in the model to arbitrary shocks to nominal costs as well. And what we're going to actually find is kind of interesting, namely that the Phillips curve you get when you do this is actually nearly identical to the one that we typically work with in macro models, namely a Calvo-Phillips curve, where basically the statement is going to be that there's some kappa here, some slope of that Phillips curve, so that the menu cost model implied Phillips curve really looks like a Calvo-Phillips curve just for some kappa here. Now, in some sense, we write down the fancy menu cost model, but at the end of the day, it seems like the Phillips curve is an old one that we already know. And so what implications does that have? So we're going to then confront this Phillips curve with the macro data. And kind of, if non-surprisingly almost, we're going to find that this kappa here is very large. So it's much steeper. The Phillips curve is much steeper than we typically find it to be in the macro time series data. And in particular, there's also no inertia in this Phillips curve. So it's perfectly forward looking, right? And so we find basically that the basic, menu cost models that we're going to work with, and I'll be explicit in a second, they're not going to match out of the box. They're not going to match the macro time series data. And so what we then try to do is we try to, bring them together. You bring the menu cost models and the macro time series data together. So we propose a resolution by combining these menu cost models with informational rigidities that slow down the adjustment of inflation to marginal costs. Okay, let me jump straight into it. I don't have that much time and a lot of material. So what's the kind of model that we're going to look at? And this is going to be really like a basic workhorse menu cost model that we're going to start with. Okay, so we're going to work with a standard quadratic approximation, and everything is on that slide. So this is the entirety of the model. So there's a mass 1 of firms, and every firm I is going to choose the optimal sort of path of log prices, PIT, in order to minimize some discounted stream of costs. And so what is in that cost term? Basically, there's going to be a difference between the log price at every given point versus the optimal price, PI star, in that period. And there's a cost that comes from menu cost, which you have to pay when you change the price over time. So what's that optimal cost, optimal price that you'd like to charge? This depends on the history of past idiosyncratic shocks. So this first term is really just a random walk here, and it also depends on what the nominal wages or the nominal cost in general is that we have in that given period. Okay, what's that menu cost? That menu cost we assume we're allowed to be random. It's either 0, in which case there would be a free adjustment that the firm can make, or it's some positive number, some xi here, which is a normal menu cost. And the probability of a free adjustment, we're going to set to lambda. And so once all these firms choose their optimal prices, at the end of the day, we can sort of aggregate up all these price choices and get the price index PT at every given period, and also get inflation as just a change in these log PTs. Okay, so if you look at this from sort of a helicopter perspective, all that's going on here is that we feed in a path for these nominal wages. And once every firm optimizes, at the end of the day, we're going to get out a path of these prices. So at the end of the day, what all this is a mapping from a given path of nominal wages that we feed in to a given path, a given path of nominal prices that come out. And this relationship is what we're going to use in a second to actually compute the Phillips curve. Now, before I go there, let me just spend one slide to show you, to tell you what kind of models are nested here or almost nested. So a Golos of Lucas model, for example, is nested here because this is a model, this is a special case of this model where there's no free adjustments. And so whenever you want to adjust, you have to pay a menu cost. The Nakamura-Steinson, Calvo plus model is basically going to correspond to having some share of free adjustments, lambda, that's somewhere between 0 and 1. And the Midrigan model, would be a small extension of the model that I outlined, where basically we have an additional product that you can also adjust whenever you adjust the first one, and there's infrequent shocks in that model as well. The Calvo model is obviously also nested. It's a very specific special case where the menu cost part is sort of assumed away, where the menu cost itself is infinite, and so you can only adjust to get hit by this free adjustment shock. Okay, so we have this model set up. It's a standard random menu cost model, and now what we want to do is we're going to get to that Phillips curve. Okay, and we're going to do this in 2 steps. So the first step is going to be characterizing a relationship between an arbitrary path of nominal wage shocks, small nominal wage shocks, and what they imply to for the path of nominal prices. And the second step is then going to be our Phillips curve, which is going to be the relationship of an arbitrary real marginal cost shock, which we're going to take to be the real wage here. So W over P is the marginal cost here, to the response of inflation over time. Okay, and this is what we want to get at. This is our sort of Phillips curve that we really, that we always put into our DSGE models. So how are we going to do this? Let's start with the first step. Okay, so we're going to start the model in the steady state. We're going to feed in a shock to nominal wages, so some arbitrary path to nominal wages, and we're going to assume, and so based on what I told you already, you already know that at the end of the day, given any path for nominal wages, you can back out by solving the menu cost model what the implied path of prices is, right? That's sort of the outcome of this model. Now, when I linearize this relationship, I basically see that the sort of small impulse response of prices is just sort of the total derivative of this expression. And if you stack this equation, you get that really what it is that there's a matrix equation here that if I feed in a shock to nominal wages, which I'm going to stack as a vector here, then there's some matrix that links that shock to the observed price response. Okay, and this matrix in between is really just the set of derivatives of price responses at some point t to nominal wage shocks at some other point s, either in the past, present, or in the future. Okay, so this object we're going to call the nominal price Jacobian, and it really just links how nominal wage shocks in the model affect nominal prices in the model. And so just again, every column of this nominal price Jacobian will correspond basically to an impulse response to a one-time shock to nominal wages. So for example, the first column of this Jacobian would basically, of this matrix would basically just be the price level response to a one-time unanticipated shock, to nominal wages, like to W0. Okay. Now, a very simple special case for this matrix is, a case of flexible prices. So in that case, this matrix is just the identity matrix, right? Because now with flexible prices, all the firms would be doing is they would set the price always equal to the nominal wage shock that has materialized, and so dP would just be equal to dW. Okay, so this is the first step. This is telling us, how to map any shock to nominal wages to response of nominal prices. Now we're going to take one more step and see whether from this model we can learn about what happens to the relationship between real marginal cost and prices. Okay, so now we're going to take as given a path of these real marginal costs, or here real wages. I'm just calling it real marginal costs because that's how we typically build it into DSG models. And now it's no longer such an easy relationship, because now if you write down what this, the menu cost model gives you a relationship between, the price at every given period as a function of marginal costs times prices at any other arbitrary period. So now prices show up on both sides. And so we have to solve sort of a fixed point. But that turns out to be not particularly hard once we linearize that equation again and focus on small shocks to real marginal cost. And so we end up with a relationship that basically gives us, using this nominal price Jacobian, gives us a way to figure out what for a given path of real marginal cost, the response of the price level is. And then the relationship that we really want is, the Phillips curve that we really want is how to go from a real marginal cost to inflation. Okay, and there's some object here that the precise, math doesn't really matter that much right now. So what is going to matter is that there's some matrix here that we're going to call J. This is what we're going to call sort of the Phillips curve Jacobian. And that tells us how to get from an arbitrary impulse response for marginal cost to the impulse response of inflation. Okay, and this is a very, very general, form of a Phillips curve. Yeah.
Ludwig, yeah. Question on the computation of this. The way you compute is like, I know that the models are non-linear, no? And then you simulate impulse response of the model for the first one, for example, the nominal thing. And then of course, it is discrete. You can get all the points, and then those points are your J. And with this, you compute the J norm. And with the J norm, you compute the...
Exactly. So basically what we do is we start with this J norm because that's really easy to compute in principle. We use some speed ups, but at the end of the day, it's easy to compute because all I need to do is I need to solve the menu cost model for specific, one-time shocks, right? Maybe I feed in a shock today, then one-time shock today to nominal wages, then I would get the first column as the impulse response of prices with respect to that one-time shock, right? Now I can get the second column by feeding in basically, a shock to nominal wages at date 1. And again, I compute what is, the price level over time, and that I would use as the second column. And so, column by column, I can figure out exactly what these price level responses are to nominal wage shocks at different dates, and that gives me this J norm. And basically what this equation is telling us is that once we have J norm, we can actually figure out what the real, what the sort of the Phillips curve relationship is, which we define as, the relationship between real marginal cost and prices. And so that only depends on these J norms. So once I have those J norms computed, I can compute this expression, and I get the responses of the price level, and then I just take a first difference, and I get the response of inflation. Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. And so at the end of the day, all we're going to do is we're going to compute J norm, and with using that, we're going to compute J. And both of these matrices are going to be sufficient statistics in the sense that once I know them, I can compute the price and inflation responses to arbitrary shocks to nominal costs and arbitrary shocks to real marginal costs. And we're going to use that to, see what these J's look like and compare what happens between, menu cost and Calvo models, and also use that to embed that into DSGE models, which I think also hasn't been done before. Okay, let me give you a simple example with a Calvo-Phillips curve so that everybody's on board. So a Calvo-Phillips curve, right, is just following this very simple expression, right? So inflation today can be recursively written as just kappa times current marginal cost plus beta times expected inflation tomorrow. And so if I solve this forward, right, what I get is that basically this is perfectly forward-looking. So my inflation today really is just a discounted sum of expected future marginal costs, where this discounting is with the discount factor beta, and this is all scaled with kappa. So kappa basically scales inflation up and down here. And so how do I go from that to sort of this J that I outlined? So basically these coefficients will immediately inform what the elements of this J matrix are, right? To see this, let's look at the first column of this J matrix. So the first column, as I said, right, that's the impulse response to a one-time shock to real marginal cost. So I shock marginal cost today and then no more in the future. And so using this equation here, you see that all this then picks up is a term at s equals 0. So this just picks up a kappa today, which is right the element here. And then in the future, there's nothing that will be left of this shock because this is perfectly forward-looking. And so starting tomorrow, there's no more shock, right? So you get zeros below this kappa here. Now let's go to the next column. Here, there's a shock, right? This column is the impulse response of inflation to a shock tomorrow to marginal cost, but in no other time, just tomorrow. So then what happens to inflation? Well, it responds now with some discounting because that shock happens in the future. And so you get the initial response of inflation, which is kappa times beta. And then tomorrow, in the same period of the shock, again, you get kappa. And then after that, you again get zeros, because once the shock is in the past, there's no more inflation response, because again, the Calvin model is perfectly forward-looking. Okay, so you get the idea that basically what's happening here is that you get, kappas along the diagonal, and the further you are away from the time of the shock, the further you're away from the diagonal, you get more and more discounting. Perfect. So one thing that is going to be helpful is actually plotting this, where I'm going to show you now, for each one of these columns, what the impulse response basically of inflation looks like over time. Okay. So this is the right plot here. Just focus on the right panel for a second. So what this shows you is that is the columns of J plotted across, how much, across time. Okay. So for example, this blue line here, which peaks at day 30, is basically the 30th column of J, which is the impulse response of inflation to a one-time marginal cost shock at day 30. Okay. And again, what you see here is exactly what we saw in the matrix. It's largest on impact of the shock, where it's kappa, and the further inflation is away from, the further we are away from the shock, the more discounted the inflation response is. Okay, and all the columns are basically identical. It's just that they peak at different points in time, and then afterwards always become zero, because this model is perfectly forward-looking. Okay, so you get always these, kind of 10 shapes. On the left, you see the nominal Jacobians. I'm not going to have that much time to explain what's going on here, but basically, just to be brief, if you focus on this 10-shaped structure here that peaks around 30, this would be the price level response to a nominal wage change in period 30. Okay, and so why is this 10 shape? Basically, what's going on here is that for a long time, price setters don't have to think about this shock because it's far in the future, and they expect to be able to set their prices again, closer to the date. But once you get close to that shock, date of the shock, firms are going to take into account that they might not be able to adjust their price before the shock hits. And so you get that the price level increases slowly already in advance of the shock. And then once the shock is over, the price level will remain elevated for some time, as some firms still haven't been able to adjust their price down to the original level. And so that's why you get this sort of 10-shaped response. Okay, the key thing is the right panel. That's what we really want to focus on. The left one is sort of the stepping stone towards getting these real marginal, these Phillips curve Jacobians. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to compute these objects in a second for menu cost models. And then we're going to ask, how close are they to the ones implied by Calvin models? And so to answer this question of how close they are, we need some measure of proximity. And so the easiest one that we can think of is the following. So imagine you have two J's, two Phillips curve Jacobians, one say for a menu cost model and one for a Calvin model for some kappa. Okay. What we're going to do to get some measure of distance between those two Phillips curves is we're going to feed in a marginal cost shock, and let's normalize that to have a standard deviation of 1. And then we're going to compute with that specific shock to marginal cost, we're going to compute the difference of the inflation responses across the two models, right? So if these were these were the same model, then these would obviously always collapse to 0. In general, the difference is obviously not always 0. And so what we're going to do is we're going to compute the standard deviation of that difference. And then we're going to compute the worst case standard deviation, basically, for any process of marginal cost we might feed it. And it turns out that at the end of the day, this worst case standard deviation is really just the Euclidean matrix norm of the difference between the Phillips curve Jacobian of the menu cost model and the Phillips curve Jacobian of the Calvin model. And we add a little normalization here so that if you were to compare two Calvo models with each other, you get just really nicely, you get just that it's the difference, that the distance is just the difference of the two slopes of the two kappas. But that's immaterial to the results. Okay, so this will be our distance. So for any kappa, we can compute this matrix norm, and then we see what the distance is. And what we're going to do is kind of natural. We're then going to compute the minimum, the minimizer of this distance. So we're going to compute the kappa that gives us sort of the best possible fit of the Calvo model to the menu cost model. Okay, so this is what we're going to do now. I'm going to show you nominal price Jacobians, and then importantly, Phillips curve Jacobians for three different menu cost models: the Golosov-Lucas model, the Nakamura-Steinson model, and the Midrigan model. And then we're going to see how well we get a Calvo Phillips curve Jacobian to fit these Jacobians. Okay, let me just flash the results for nominal price Jacobians here. So these are the nominal price Jacobians that we compute for these three menu cost models. And you see that the magnitudes are a bit different, right? The Golosov-Lucas model is a bit more spiky and has greater magnitudes, which is indicative of greater price flexibility, whereas the Nakamura-Steinson and Midrigan models are a bit, smaller in magnitudes and have less spiked, columns here. But the key thing is, once I look at, if you look at these tents, they kind of look like conceptually like the ones we saw for the Calvo model. And in fact, if we compute a Calvo model that minimizes the distance to these, you see that they almost perfectly overlap. It's kind of an amazing coincidence. You write down the menu cost model with all its non-linearity and pricing behavior and the SS bands, and then once you feed in a small nominal cost shock at a given point in time, you can fit that response of the price level for any point, for any shock, any point, any time when you feed in the shock, you can fit that perfectly with the Calvo model, with a single Calvo model. Okay, there are some deviations, and if you squint hard enough, you're going to see that the Nakamura-Steinson model has a little bit of a deviation here at the top, and similar for the Midrigan model. But overall, this is a really, really close fit. Now, it's not quite as close for the Phillips curve Jacobians, but it's still very close. So for the Phillips curve Jacobians, this is what we find for these three models. And again, you see for the Golosov-Lucas model, the magnitudes are largest, which indicates most price flexibility. And so what you see here is, it conceptually looks like, what we had for the Calvo model, right? For example, here, the response that peaks at day 20 is the response of inflation to a one-time, real marginal cost shock at day 20. It peaks at day 20 exactly in the Calvo model. It's sort of weaker in anticipation of the shock, and it's basically zero afterwards. And again, if we try to fit the Calvo model to match these Jacobians, we kind of see that they actually do a pretty good job of matching it. Now, it's not as good as for the nominal price Jacobian. So for example, for the Midrigan model, you see that it's a bit more spiky around the time of the shock. And for the Nakamura-Steinson model, it's a bit off initially, but overall, the fit is really great. And one way to actually sort of illustrate that is you can take these Jacobians and just hit them with specific real marginal cost shocks. So imagine we have a marginal cost, AR1 process with different persistence parameters. And when you feed that into these models, you see that basically the Calvo model that we pick as the best approximation basically gets all these impulse responses right. And so at the end of the day, if I want to work with these menu cost models, basically all I need to know is what is the approximating Calvo model, and I can throw that into my preferred model. For example, here we do this for a Smets and Wouters model. I can throw that into the Smets and Wouters model, and then I would have, for example, in this case, this is the first Smets and Wouters model that actually has menu cost pricing in it. And it's really easy to do because all you need to do is you need to figure out what the approximating Calvo parameters, and then you can literally just work with the Calvo Phillips curve. Okay, so the approximation works really well. And so then this raises the question, okay, well, now we know what the Phillips curve looks like of these menu cost models. So
Ludwig, can I just briefly ask you, just to understand, so this thing, to find this approximating Calvo model, don't I need to solve the other model I want to approximate in the first place?
Yes.
As in, like,
so,
what do I? And
so
I guess then the approximation depends still on parameters, right? And so you see where I'm going, right?
Yes, we're going to have more on that in the paper. We have some ideas of actually being able to pick the kappa even without solving the full model. So, for example, if you look at this, for example, kind of all I would need to know to figure out the approximation is not, what the menu cost model looks like for every single column, right? All I would have to know is maybe one column is enough. And once I know that column, I can fit, I can try to fit, that column with a Calvo model. And then by the sort of magic of this result, not just that column will fit, but all the other columns will fit as well. So we basically in the paper, we're going to describe ways to actually use this result in order to reduce the computational burden that it takes to actually compute the Phillips curve that underlies these models. But this is an important avenue, and we're not quite there yet to having the results down and being able to share them. But that's obviously important, yeah. But in any case, so we have that Phillips curve now, and so the question is that Phillips curve in agreement with macro time series data, or do we need something else to get it to match? And we're going to explore this for now in two simple ways. The first one is we're just going to look at aggregate macro data and compute autocorrelations of inflation, and this is something that Fuhrer has done in his handbook chapter. And then we're going to see what autocorrelations are implied by menu cost models versus what do we have in the data. Okay, and the second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at impulse responses of the price level to monetary shocks like Romer shocks, and then see do these models imply the same kind of shape that we have and magnitude that we have in the data. Okay, so let's start with the autocorrelations. So here on the right you see basically the autocorrelations of inflation as function of the lag between the lag and the autocorrelation function. And so you see that there's a lot of persistence in core CPI and core PCE. And on the left, you see the common proxies for marginal cost. And you see that there is some persistence there as well, but not as much as in inflation. And people have taken this to argue that there is intrinsic persistence in inflation over and above the persistence that of the marginal cost shock that goes into the Phillips curve. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take these menu cost models, and we're going to try to we're going to feed in a marginal cost process that matches the marginal cost autocorrelations on the left, and then we're going to try to see how close we get to matching the inflation persistence on the right. Okay, and if we do that, this is what we find. Okay, so the two inflation persistence, two inflation autocorrelations are still there, orange and blue, and then the three menu cost models are these dashed line dot dashed lines, and so what you see is that basically all these three lines are on top of each other, and none of them generate enough persistence for inflation in the data. And the reason this is because basically none of these models generates intrinsic persistence, because they operate like a Calvo model, they inherit the persistence entirely from the marginal cost process that you should put in. And that, as we saw, that marginal cost process is not going to have enough persistence for inflation. And that's why there's too little persistence implied by the two models, or there's too little inertia, if you like, implied by the menu cost models. So the second thing we do here is we feed in, we look at identified monetary shocks. So we take a simple Romer regression. We figure out the response of the price level, and we also figure out what the response is of several proxies for marginal cost. And so one proxy I'm just going to focus on for now is the log labor share, and this has been, for example, used by the famous paper by Gali-Gertler. And so when we run this in the data, just to show you what we find a price level that's sort of characteristically sluggish, right? It does basically nothing until 6 quarters out, and then it sort of takes off. The labor share is also very sluggish initially, and then it sort of increases in a sort of hump shape that goes back towards 0. And this is going to be sort of our measure of marginal cost that we're going to feed in line with what Gully-Gertler already did. And so we're going to feed this measure into the menu cost models and see what kind of a price level response these models imply. And just focus on the left plot here. The right plot is an alternative approach that we do using a more structural model, the Smets and Waters model. Here we just, on the left, we just feed in literally the labor share marginal cost response from the data. We feed that into the models and then compute the price level. And so basically what you see is that these models, especially the Golosov-Lucas model, but also the other two models, imply a far greater price level response than what we have in the data. So the data is the green line that's sort of squished towards 0 at the bottom, which is much, much smaller than what we get from menu cost models. It also, note that these models predict a much too, fast increase of the price level. There's no sort of inaction for like 6 quarters or so. And so this raises a question, okay, so how should we bridge this gap between sort of models that we really like because they really match the micro behavior of prices very well, and the macro evidence on price responses to shocks and the inertia that we see at the macro level. And so we're going to bridge this gap by basically adding informational rigidities, and we're going to build obviously on a literature that has already tried to explore the effect of informational rigidities here. And here what we would like to direct this literature towards is thinking also about the aggregate Phillips curve, with respect to the relationship between inflation and real marginal cost. And we're going to feed in informational rigidities in 2 ways. The first one is we're going to add a Mancuries style informational rigidity, where basically we assume that every period, a random fraction theta of people is going to be able to update their information set and learn about any shock that has happened in the past. And whereas the other agents, the 1 minus theta other agents, are not going to get an updated information set. And the second model that we played around with, which we like actually intuitively, is basically like a Mancuries model with an additional twist. Namely, we're going to allow there to be endogenous diffusion of information in addition to the random learning that's happening in the Mancuries model. So there we're going to assume that in addition to the random theta of people that is going to learn, we're going to assume that there's also a fraction mu every period that is going to meet and share information. And this turns out to be really nice, because this actually sort of generates a more sluggish response of the information sets over time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take these information rigidity parameters, the theta in the case of Mancuries and theta and mu in the case of this information diffusion model, and try to pick them so that they match the impulse response of the price level in response to the marginal cost shock that we feed in from Rome and Romer. So again, focus on the left panel here only. So what you see here in green is the price level response. And what you see in blue is the Mancuries model's response. And what you see in red is the information diffusion model's response. And basically what you see is that what goes really well in these what works really well in these information rigidity models is that you really nicely get the sluggish response of the price level to the shock. And then what you get is the magnitude you can also get matched, which is much smaller than what you get in a menu cost model without these frictions. And so basically what you see here is at the core is really just a menu cost model that matches individual price setting behavior, on top of which we put information frictions, so that in addition to matching micro pricing behavior, now this model also matches aggregate macro sort of time series moments. And what we think is nice is that this model also does really well in matching the autocorrelation function that we've seen over time. So now the red and the blue model, as you can see, are well in between the autocorrelations that we get for inflation from the aggregate time series data. All right, let me conclude. So what we attempt in this very early stage project still is to operationalize, so to speak, menu cost models. So we start with computing Phillips curves for menu cost models. We note along the way that actually it turns out that they're quite close to the Phillips curves of Calvo models. And that's partly why they have such a hard time matching the macro data without any additional ingredients. So for example, the slope is too steep and there's a lack of inertia inherent in these models. But information frictions can possibly bridge this gap, bring the slope down, and generate inertia. Well, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to more comments.
Okay, thank you, Ludwig. It's very, very interesting. And so I will ask you some questions. The first thing is like for small shocks, the equivalence between time and state dependent model. I think there is something in one of the Alvarez-Lippi papers, and the question is that how realistic is, for example, the shock that we had now was not a small shock, was not a monetary shock either, but yeah, and when you have like big shocks and this equivalence is not anymore true. But I think the question, most relevant question for me is like, okay, when you have information, you can match the macro with the model that's Nakamura, Tyson, and Calvo plus model that also, in general, this model we know that can fit reasonably well microdata model, but not necessarily the same parameters that you are using. I don't know how did you pick the Nakamura, Tyson, Calvo plus parameters fit both the micro and the macro, and probably this is going to be. I know that's the what you are showing is just a first version of ongoing work, but
yeah, let me very briefly respond, and I think there's another question by Eduardo Silverman. So on the equivalence between Calvo and menu cost models, I don't think this has been known because what we do right in our paper is we think about basically the set of all impulse responses to arbitrary nominal and real cost shocks, and I don't think Alvarez and Lippi, at least to the best of my knowledge, have done that. I think what they have very nicely shown is how you can think of the cumulative impulse response in menu cost models and Calvo models, and have like super nice characterizations of that. I don't think they generally look at the whole set of all impulse responses to arbitrary nominal and real cost shocks, and I think that's where sort of our equivalence result is nice. It's a numerical result, so this is not an analytical result, so we don't have the same sort of nice expressions that they have, but I think it's equally powerful. In terms of large shocks, this is something that we can explore more, but just suffice it to say, for most sort of DSGE models, right, they're all to first order, and so to the extent that we think of doing experiments in DSGE models, I think the small shock limit would be exactly what is needed. For large shocks, totally agree with you. There's definitely that's where the menu cost models potentially are going to be very different to Calvo models, but this is something that we're still exploring. And then for the Nakamura-Steinson parameters, we basically pick the standard parameters they also pick. So we in our infra-rigidity model, we actually go with their multi-sector version, but we don't deviate on the sort of on the menu cost model parameters from what they have. All we do is we add on top the information frictions, and there we give us some freedom as to pick how strong these information frictions have to be to match the macro data.
Thank you.
Can I ask? So thanks, it was a great presentation. So my question is, from a practical point of view, from someone that is in the central bank running some new Keynesian models, what I found very nice in the first part of the presentation, that you can capture the menu cost model to a single parameter that you can distort to capture that. Is there any way, I don't know if you already thought about it, but is there any way that you can distort the new Keynesian model in a minimalistic way to capture the role of the information frictions that help you match the other macro moments without have to modeling information frictions?
This is an amazing question. This is something that we've recently started thinking about as well. Like, what's sort of the minimal description, the minimal deviation from the Calvo-Phillips curve that we need in order to still be able to capture the information frictions. We don't have an answer for that for you yet. These information frictions are a bit hard to work with typically in standard DSG models. So we're working on right now a way to try to think about exactly this question, like how can we minimally alter, sort of, is it going to show up like as an indexation parameter, right? Or is it going to show up as something else? So this is exactly what we're working on these days. So I'm sorry, I don't have the answers for you yet.
Okay, thanks. Once I have the answer, I will ask Rodolfo.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Ludwig. Now we have to rush for the second paper. Gregor is going to present us a macro labor paper.
Okay, let me see. All right, thanks a lot for putting this together. I'm just gonna adjust my screen a little bit. So this is a joint work with Jan Nimczyk, who is an assistant professor in Berlin at ESMT, and Isaac Sorkin, who's at Stanford. The paper, broadly speaking, joins, I think, at this point, fairly sizable literature that is after the relation of market power and sort of a host of macroeconomic outcomes. I think it's fair to say that this literature shares a premise that market power in sort of various dimensions might be on the rise. A lot of people nowadays argue that one aspect of COVID is going to be that the big firms are going to come out of this even bigger, and the small firms are going to get wiped out. Now, that literature for a long time was sort of primarily concerned with product market outcomes, as is sort of antitrust, I think historically, and really just sort of looking at consumer outcomes. But more recently, people have observed that, of course, if there's less and less competition among big firms, that might also have consequences for input prices. And so, if one input is labor, so it might depress wages. And I think the narrative is fairly obvious. If for whatever reason you have more and more concentration in a local labor market, that effectively means there's less competition between employers for workers, and that might depress wages. And one way of sort of putting this is, Walmart comes to town, wipes out all the mom and pop stores. That might, they might jack up prices because they gain power in the product market, but they might also be now the only employer in town, and that might depress wages. And sort of that's sort of what we're after in this paper. Yeah, so with that said, here are the high-level questions we're after. How what's sort of the transmission mechanism from concentration in the labor market to wages, and can we say something quantitative about how much this might matter? All right. So here's how we go about this. So we'll be working in a frictional labor market. And the point of departure is the observation that competition for workers, the extent of competition for workers, gets encoded in outside options in a frictional setting. So basically, the firm and the worker ask themselves, what other opportunities are there in this local labor market for the worker, and that is an important determinant of the wage. Now, the first key deviation we sort of take from the textbook model is that we'll be working with non-atomistic employers. So employers that account for sort of a strictly positive fraction of employment in town. And then we ask, do these large employers compete with their own job openings? And we'll sort of argue that this big entity will give it a means to evade sort of competition across sort of the various jobs it has. And that's the extent to which sort of size will translate into into a form of market power in the labor market. How are we going to get this off the ground? Through sort of a particular micro foundation, which I sort of mentioned here in the second bullet, which is going to be sort of an off-equilibrium threat of that large player, that large employer, to effectively close its door to a worker under a trade breakdown. That's how it's going to be modeled. But the basic notion is just that big players don't compete across the various jobs they hold. And so if you have the two big steel mills in town, if they're merging into one big employer, that just reduces the extent of competition, because these jobs that were previously sort of associated with two different employers, they're now under one roof, and that per se is going to depress wages. So that's how it's going to work. Now the model will tell us how to measure concentration and how that maps to wages, that particular measure of concentration. And that'll give us a way to effectively do a form of accounting using microdata to assess to which extent this is, a powerful mechanism. Here's where we do it. We'll do this in Austria, in Austrian microdata. One thing you need to do whenever you talk about market power, you need to take a stance on the boundaries of a market. So we'll follow a method that one of my co-authors developed in his job market paper, which is sort of a method to endogenously cluster firms into groups. And then we'll ask, based on our model, how much this form of market power concentration, how much does it depress wages in levels, what's been happening over time, so what's been happening over the last couple of decades. And then the third and final part of the paper is going to be a bit more speculative, but I think interesting. There's nowadays a lot of talk in antitrust authorities, which historically are really just tasked with sort of assessing the product market consequences of mergers and acquisitions, to also assess the consequences for the labor market. And we think sort of our model is a useful tool to sort of assess those. Okay, so that's going to be the exercises we'll be doing. Obviously, interrupt me in case you have any questions or anything is unclear. All right, I'm going to skip over. Well, I actually have until 4:10. So let me just briefly mention that there is sort of a literature that uses the sort of Robinson style notion or way of thinking about market power that has been primarily employed in the product market to also think about the labor market. This paper by Berger et al. Here might be the most well known. And in these settings, firms have sort of upward sloping labor supply curves at the firm level. They suppress quantities, and that's sort of the extent to which they exert market power. The key distinction, in my view, between sort of that body of work and ours is that we're really working in a setting where first, market power fundamentally derives from being sizable, being large, not from having a certain sort of elasticity associated with your local labor supply curve. And second, our mechanism is a pure model of rent extraction. So it's a way for employers to squeeze workers without manipulating sort of quantities. Whereas if you live in the Robinson world, if you think about sort of monopsony or monopoly, the way, so we teach it in 101, then it's sort of inherently tied to quantities. And sort of more market power, comes usually with sort of a suppression of quantities. And that's sort of the key distinction. Anyway, here's the setup. It's really a textbook model of a frictional labor market, sort of Pissarides 101 with a twist or two. So there's homogeneous workers that can be employed or unemployed. When they're unemployed, they receive some flow value that's less than the normalized flow value of output they produce when they work for a firm. We'll later have heterogeneous firms, but for now, firms are homogeneous as well. All right, now first twist, these employers, they're labeled by I, they control a potentially strictly positive fraction of the job openings that sort of roll into town. Yeah, that's why we chose this sort of label of granular search. So these workers search across granular, non-atomistic firms. The rest is just standard assumptions. Matches at some rate blow up, then the worker flows back into unemployment. There's no on-the-job search. There is, discounting a single homogeneous good. Things are set in discrete time, and we're just considering steady states. Okay. Now, here's a second slight twist that's not really sort of fundamental to the story, but the matching process is such that at any point in time, there's unemployed workers, they're looking for jobs, and there's an earn ball matching function. So think of a process where these employers, they send sort of applications towards job openings. They do so in an uncoordinated fashion. And so the V job openings on the other side of the labor market may potentially receive multiple applications. Now, employers that receive at least one application for a job opening, they will end up hiring one random applicant from the queue in front of the factory gate, if you will. Now, we assume that everyone here is homogeneous, so all job openings will be viable, and so that means that you can write the rate of finding a job as a function purely of market tightness, which is the ratio of job openings to job seekers. Okay, and so you denote this by lambda. All right, so I guess this is the most important slide. So write down the value of being unemployed. So you enter this labor market as a young worker. So what's your value function? Well, you'll be unemployed for a period by assumption. You draw some B. Next period, you find a job at rate lambda, and that job is at it's a random search setting. So it's at employer I with probability f of I, because employer I accounts for a fraction f of employment in town. And then, as we'll see in a second, your continuation value, the value of being employed at that shop, is going to depend on its name, on I. And if you don't find a job, you'll remain unemployed. Okay. Totally textbook. Now, observe that what happens in these models is that usually, in sort of a large class of these models, wages are depending on outside options, which is for the worker in the wage bargain with a firm, or in a sort of in a marriage with a firm, is unemployment. Okay. Now, suppose for a second we would use this object as the relevant outside option of a worker in the wage bargain with a large firm. Well, if the worker claimed this was his or her outside option, well, the firm would say, hold on a second, I'm I'm one of those I's. So what you're doing right now is you're claiming some of my own jobs as part of your outside option. You're using sort of myself as a threat point. And basically the key idea of the setup is that we'll now sort of give the firm a way to sort of remove its own vacancies, its own shops from the threat point. How are we going to do it? I don't want to get into too much detail, but effectively, we'll give the firm credibly pledges that on the off equilibrium path, where the worker turns around and walks out the door, that in that event, effectively the firm will close its door to the worker in the future. There's a couple of sort of refinements to that statement, but that's the basic notion. And then you can sort of see how that removes, the firm's future vacancies from the threat point, because that door is going to remain closed in the future. Okay, so then this sort of refined outside option that accounts for this notion of granularity and being non-atomistic can approximately be written like this. I just omit a couple of sort of cluttered terms that don't matter. So you still get your B if you walk out the door, but the next period you can work anywhere else in town, but not for the jobs that I control. Okay. So again, what this does is that in a world where there's just, a few large employers left, you can't really, threaten those with their own jobs. And so you can immediately see how sort of consolidation of, many competing employers into sort of larger entities reduces the amount of competition for workers and depresses wages. And see that, like, if you really live in sort of the factory town where there's just, I guess in Austria it would be the ski resort town where there's just like one big employer, then effectively that wipes out all competition and really sort of, entirely wipes out workers outside opportunities that are sort of truly outside that large entity. Okay, so the rest is again pretty standard. We'll set wages via like axiomatic Nash. That's sort of the standard in this class of model. The important thing is that obviously the wages is some sort of big fixed point, because the employer and the applicant or the worker sit down, discuss the wage. The wage doesn't just depend on the size of the current employer, but also sort of on the entire distribution of employment shares in the labor market, because everyone recognizes, everyone behaves in the same fashion. So you need to find the fixed point, and that's sort of what we'll be doing now. Okay, just effectively solving the model. Okay, in order to do that, I basically will first show you how the model will want us to measure concentration, and then I'll show you how concentration, this measure of concentration, will enter the key equations. All right, so this looks a bit messy, but it's really just a Herfindahl. Okay, so this is the concentration index that we'll be measuring in the data. Has these many pieces, but the first piece is literally the Herfindahl index, which is just the sum of the squared employment shares. All right, why does this show up? Why is this sort of measure that often is used in an ad hoc way? Why is this actually a natural measure for concentration here? Well, in a random search world, the sum of the squared shares is literally just the ex-ante probability that are run into the same guy twice in a row. Okay, and that's exactly where there sort of limits to competition here, because it's exactly the jobs of the same large, non-atomistic player that are not in competition with each other. Okay, and so that's why it's sort of a natural measure to show up here. It's more terms. It's these cubed and so forth terms, because it doesn't stop at the secondary encounter, right? So you could sort of keep running into the same large firm over and over again, and that's why these higher order terms show up here as well. Quantitatively, they don't really matter, because like if you start cubing and so forth, things just decay really quickly. But anyway, that's the full expression. What this guy does here, it's just squeezing the bounds of this index between onto the unit interval. Okay, and so this concentration measure is equal to 1. Again, if you just have one single monopsonist, and it's equal to 0 in the, if you will, in the competitive limit. All right, so now I'll show you how that's going to enter the key equations. All right, to that end, think of omega bar as sort of average wages. It's the average worker share of the flow surplus. And so you can think of 1 minus omega bar as a way to as average profits. All right, so let me sort of talk you through this expression. The first piece is just the standard sort of Nash share. So in a static setting, average profits would just be 1 minus worker bargaining power. All right, so now you have competition, because there's other employment opportunities in town, and we live in sort of a dynamic, forward-looking setting. And so, in the textbook model, the competition is encoded here. So what does this term do? This term just captures that the workers can point to the door and say, look, at rate lambda, I'm going to find another job. I'm going to get a fraction F of the surplus. That's really competition, for you as the employer. And that, as you can see from this expression, shifts resources towards the worker. All right, and so up to these two wedges here that are marked in color, that's literally Pissarrida's section 2, like sort of the textbook equation for profits in a frictional setting. And so now you can see how this sort of extension where you have these large players that don't compete with their own jobs, how that shows up as these two wedges. What do they capture? You can sort of think of that first wedge as one that's about the outside option, and that's sort of what I've been talking about. There's really just sort of less competition if there's many large firms around, and that then partially wipes out competition. In the limit where there's just one monopsonist, you sort of like the outside option is fully gone. There's a second piece which effectively captures that what the firm does is also inflating sort of the inside option. But I don't want to get into too much detail here because I omitted a couple of things that I guess I have 15 to 18 minutes. Anyway, the important piece is this here. And you can sort of see how it acts. All right. So before I take this to the data, I'm now just going to briefly tell you how you can extend this to allow for firms that actually differ not only in terms of size, but also in terms of productivity. Okay. And so in particular, now assume that firms produce some flow output that may potentially differ across employers, and the rest of the setting is virtually unchanged. Now you can see that there's now two different dimensions to sort of concentration here. A market can be concentrated from the perspective of a worker because there's all the employment is concentrated, but of course also because all the productivity shares, if you will, are concentrated in a few shops. And then I can sort of rederive that expression for average profits, which is here now for the extended model. And those turn out to be just average profits in that baseline model, the equation I've showed you earlier, times 1 plus this wedge, where you should think of this additional wedge here, this mathcal P, as just basically picking up the size productivity covariance. Okay, so what does it mean? Well, you have your sort of benchmark expression for profits. Now, if it turns out that size and productivity are positively co-varying on top of that, then that shifts resources towards employers, and sort of natural. Okay, so what we'll be doing in the data is effectively use that equation as an accounting equation to measure how powerful this can be. How are we going to do this? Well, go back to sort of the previous slide here. This thing I can directly measure in the data. It's literally just a Herfindahl. Okay, and then there's just like 3 or 4 other parameters. Some of them are quite easy to measure. I'll tell you how we put numbers on them. And then on top of it, the size productivity covariance. If I have data on size and productivity, that's obviously also easy to measure. And so then I can use this, in an accounting fashion to quantify how powerful it is and to decompose market power in something that's driven by the size productivity covariance and something that's driven just by size per se. Okay, and that will be sort of the name of the game for the next 15 minutes or so. Okay, so we'll take the model to Austrian microdata. And as I've already mentioned, what you need to do when you take a model like that to data is you need to take a stance on the boundaries of a labor market. And so here we follow what Jan did, sort of a method that Jan developed in his job market papers, really his contribution, that uses, think of it as effectively worker flows revealing which firms are clustered together in a labor market. So effectively, loosely speaking, if I see a lot of people move from firm A to B and no people move from firm A to C, then we're sort of grouping A together with would be rather than C. That's just loosely speaking what it does. Now, one important thing the method does, it sort of determines along the way the number of different labor markets in the Austrian setting. Okay, and so that turns out to be 370 here. And so you can sort of see why it's important, right? If the entire country is one single labor market, then I'll obviously find sort of less of a role for market power than if I sort of take the stance that, you know, every little village is its own labor market. Okay? And so here, you know, these labor markets back of the envelope have something like 150,000 workers per labor market. We complement this with using sort of standard definitions where you just use industry times geography. All right. And so we'll do this market by market, and then just aggregate up to the to national using sort of employment weights. Okay, so we're doing this on Austrian data. It covered these 18 years. Let me just briefly run through how we put numbers on the model. So, you know, FI in a model is just size, you know, counting the number of full-time employees. We do this a couple different ways. Then I need a notion of a firm level wage. There we're using some sort of two-sided AKM with time varying firm effect. You know, that's, you know, I guess reasonably uncontroversial. And then you have these parameters that you can just read off the data because they are just worker flows, right? So the job finding rate at the market time level, job separation rate, these things are easy. I guess, you know, they're doable and relatively uncontroversial. The remaining parts are a bit harder. So we don't have direct data on productivity or value added. I guess that will be an advantage of using sort of the Brazilian data sets. We don't have that. So we effectively just sort of back them out, back out productivity using the model. So we invert the model and back it out. And you lose all sorts of restrictions, but that's how we go about it. And then we're putting the flow value of unemployment to a level such that the least attractive employer in a labor market exactly breaks even / pays the reservation wage. And that seems like a plausible way of going about it. I'm open to other ways, but that's how we do it. It gives you a bargaining power that's sort of square in the middle. That seems to be my headphones just made. Anyway, I hope I can still hear you in case you want to speak up. And so then you get a really low value for how much workers like unemployment. We do a bunch of robustness with respect to that in the appendix, but I'll jump ahead to the results so we can spend some time on that. Okay, before I get there, there's sort of a question of, you know, is there some sort of notion of direct evidence for this mechanism? You know, firms here, on some level, they run these blacklists where they can credibly threaten to effectively punish a worker. And so, you know, sometimes we get asked, you know, is there anything direct? We have some sort of anecdotal stuff about this in the paper. But on a high level, of course, this sort of punishment, this micro foundation really just plays out off equilibrium. So it's a bit hard to show direct evidence because on the equilibrium, these blacklists are always empty. And I think the literature now sort of agrees that at least so far, we haven't really found any good sort of IVs for shifts in market structure or market power. But we sort of note that the fundamental mechanism in this paper is really operative through repeat encounters with the large employers in town. So the basic notion is somehow you can't quite escape the big players. And what we show in the data is we have some sort of way of measuring what we call a re-encounter rate, which effectively measures how often workers along their sort of entire career path, if you will, so return to the same shop after having worked elsewhere. And what we sort of show is that that is indeed much more frequently the case in more concentrated labor markets. And so we sort of argue that that evidence makes the mechanism empirically plausible. Okay, but that's sort of all we have in terms of direct evidence, in terms of grounding this in tightly in the data.
Gregory,
right?
Can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
Maybe this is uninformed, but you mentioned the ski resorts. Is there any sort of sector where you have reduced form, or we can possibly look at reduced form evidence, where you could maybe look at, say, concentration of different competing ski resorts in different places, and then seeing what the equilibrium wage is like in these places? Is there any sort of reduced form evidence that you can somehow
so there's basically, I had sort of this bullet here. All these papers effectively do that. So they're all running cross-sectional, loosely speaking, wage Herfindahl regressions.
Yeah.
Now, for some reason, IO decided in the 90s that it's absolutely unacceptable to put like market structure on the right-hand side. And so now we're doing this sort of in macro, but it's sort of, we've sort of stayed away from this, but there is definitely this literature that does that, and we're sort of connecting with it a little bit in the paper. But yeah, we haven't done it ourselves. Okay, so here's the Austrian labor share. So you can see it has this slight U shape. I don't quite want to speculate, because there's other things that's been driving it, but over the period covered by our data set, it's fallen by something like 3 percentage points. All right. So first piece here is sort of the various concentration measures. You can see, I mean, we're doing a productivity weighted one, an unweighted one, the Herfindahl over the wage bill. You can sort of see the levels are extremely close, and the co-movement is quite strong. Now, one thing you might say is you sort of look at this and you say, well, hold on a second, these two things should be inversely related. Doesn't look particularly promising. Now, one thing we sort of learned, when taking this to the data, is that you have to be really careful in looking at linearly aggregated sort of national indices when things sort of happening at a more local level, and the relationship you care about is highly nonlinear. Okay, in particular, what we're sort of showing here is, that the action here in our setting is really sort of in the ski valleys, and not in Vienna, if you will. So basically, this mechanism doesn't have a whole lot of bite for sort of a fairly wide range of markets, and only in the markets where concentration is already fairly high, that's where sort of the elasticity, this is really powerful. And so to the extent that there's sort of non-trivial things happening sort of within the distribution of markets, sort of looking at these linearly aggregated indices and then sort of making inference, well, market power fell, then it went up again. That's sort of like highly, or can potentially be quite misleading. Okay, so here's actual first result. So what we're doing to measure how powerful this is we're just basically killing it. Okay? And so we're basically then using these accounting equations to ask, how much would wages move if we sort of eliminated this all the way. Okay, and we're doing it stepwise. We first sort of eliminate all of the size productivity covariance, which is this sort of superstar effect type thing. And then in the second step, we also eliminate the entire sort of size concentration. What you see is the first piece is just moving the labor share up by about 1%. But if you sort of eliminate both, then you get really sizable gains for workers. So you get that the labor share moves up by 10%. So think from 63 to 66 or 70%. So that just suggests that this is these things are a little bit back of the envelope, but that in my view, that sort of suggests that this is potentially quite powerful. One thing, that sort of goes back to what we just talked about. The action really is in the ski valleys. It's the mean effect is far higher than the medium effect. I'm going to skip over these two bullets, but I briefly want to talk about this last one. So here we do exactly the same exercise where we use sort of standard notions of a local labor market, so 2-digit industry times commuting zone, and we show you how these numbers move as we sort of change the definition, the boundaries of a labor market. And so you can sort of see, first of all, if at all, we get even larger results when we use these commonly adopted definitions. And second, the more narrowly you draw the boundaries of a labor market, the more powerful this becomes, as I've already mentioned. But we sort of encourage sort of the broad consistency in terms of the numbers. All right, you can sort of talk a little bit about how this differs across income groups. And it turns out that in the Austrian setting, actually, this benefits high income earners even more in relative terms than low income earners. I don't know whether there's sort of a deeper reason for that, but that's what turns out to happen in Austria. And then sort of a second exercise, instead of rolling things all the way down to zero, we sort of roll it back in time, and that allows us to assess to which extent the evolution of concentration in the Austrian labor market has depressed or sort of potentially contributed to the decline in the labor share. And what we sort of get from this exercise is that you can sort of explain roughly sort of a percentage point of the decline in the Austrian labor share, which amounts to a third of the overall decline with this mechanism. If you sort of buy into this exercise, where again we're sort of just rolling things back in time and ask how different would things look nowadays if we still had the type of market structure we had at the base period. Okay, so then here's the final exercise. As I've already mentioned, there's nowadays quite some interest in should we task the antitrust authorities to really think through what's going to happen not only to consumers but also to workers if they okay a big merger. So what we're doing here, we're just using the model in Austria, and for the sake of it, we're merging in every single one of these labor markets the two biggest employers. We give them sort of an employment weighted average in terms of productivity, and then just ask what happens to wages. Now, unsurprisingly, the wages at these two merging firms, they fall quite a bit. Now, what I think far more interestingly, because everyone else in the local labor market recognizes, well, these two shops are no longer in competition with one another, that the overall extent of competition for workers falls, and hence wages falls across the board. Okay, so you have these strong spillovers into the rest of the labor market, reflecting that the overall extent of competition is lower now. And then just the final piece, just to sort of circle back to where this model that I presented is really distinct from sort of traditional ways of thinking about market power, is that to a first order, this is an employment neutral effect. So it's a way for firms extracting rents where they don't need to sort of manipulate quantities to move sort of prices in their favor, and that's in my view sort of a key distinction between these setups. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Here's my conclusion. Again, so the basic notion is these big shops, they can avoid competition across the various jobs they control. That gives them market power. We show you how to sort of measure concentration, how that maps to wages. The setup allows us to distinguish between these two different forms that people have thought about quite a bit: employment concentration and pure productivity concentration. And the way I think about these quantitative exercises is that they really just suggest that this type of market power is a potentially forceful tool of rent extraction for employers. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Gregor. So, questions?
I would have a question, but I'm happy to defer to anybody.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Great. Sounds super interesting. I had one small question. You mentioned that there's this very different effect for the average and for the median.
Yeah.
Does that suggest that in some markets there's a really big effects, like there's a really big effect in like some of the ski towns, or and sort of in like 95% it's like almost zero, or what's sort of the distribution of these effects? I guess I would.
Yeah, so we haven't quite sorted this out, but this is really a model of a factory town, you know, and for Austria, sort of, I guess it's the ski, but like I think for the US, it's the steel mills and sort of, it's a model that quantitatively our exercise sort of suggests that you don't really have to bother with this, you know, in a reasonably sort of diversified labor market, but to the extent that, you know, the proposal is that the two steel mills merge, then that becomes very powerful. Yeah, that's right.
It could be nice. I thought there were some ski resorts that merged over time. It could be nice to get some kind of variation from that. But
so there is,
for another paper, maybe.
There is a paper by Prager and someone else, and they look at hospital mergers. And they have some sort of, I guess, exogenous variation in terms of these mergers. And they do document, and we sort of cite that prominently because they do document that wages actually fall, but employment doesn't. And so that's why I sort of push this this distinction with the other setup.
So, my question: how crucial is the hypothesis that the markets are completely segmented in the way you evaluate empirically the model? And the second is just would be the question of insisting the question of Ludwig, in the sense that people have worked with that, but you have a model, no, that would be nice. How your model would predict a merge compared to the data. You don't need even, like when you have a model, you don't need even like to have such exogenous thing because you have a model. Big part.
Yeah. So.
And sorry, just to follow on, as I understand, your model would apply to any, since the markets are segmented, to any subset of the Austrian market. You could just apply to a part of the.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
And then would you could do those local applications?
Absolutely. We could sort of like answer that second question first. We could absolutely drill into that. I think we were partially discouraged by, you know, what we've sort of seen in the literature happening out there, and we've just wanted to first write down this model, which is new. But for sure, you could try and confront it with, and there, you know, one could easily, I think, come up with some, you know, say what I'm sometimes thinking about is sort of like government location decisions, you know, where say the government sort of like puts, you know, a huge, you know, the IRS moves from like one town to another. That's a shock to the local labor market structure, and one could sort of then say that's exogenous, and so let's absolutely there's a range of open things one can think about, and I think that those are exciting totally. In terms of the island by island, it probably matters. I think that at least from what I know about the US, there's shockingly little movement across space. You know, most people like grow up, live and die in the same zip code. So on some level, I think this island approximation might not be terrible, but I wouldn't quite know how to sort of nest this model where you have sort of like these nests, and then there's that is much easier if you sort of like, if you do really the standard Robinson, you know, you have the inner nest and the outer nest. And so that is something that might be feasible, but that would be hard work.
Okay, so any more questions? If there is no more questions, we thank you very much, Gregor and Ludwig, for excellent papers and for coming here virtually to Brazil, presenting the work. I really hope that we will have the opportunity to have you both in Brazil, especially when the meeting is a nice beach in the Northeast, as it is very often.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.